Everyone. Yeah, I used to be a government bureaucrat. But today, I don't know if Malema will call me a capitalist. Right. So I'm not going to talk too much about myself because it's just all about Rhizobia today. I just want to test if you were listening. Adriano talked about strains. He talked about fermentation process. He talked about a formulation. He talked about soil. He talked about packaging. What else did you talk about? I was not listening. I was just looking at things from a regulatory point of view. He also talked about trials, right? He also talked about soybean. Okay? What else did he talk about? Were you listening? He also talked about microorganisms, right? And then he talked about sustainability. I wish this was my first slide. But I hope I'm going to show you the connection of what he talked about and what regulatory science is all about. Keep those points in mind because it is all about the regulatory. Talking about regulatory science, do we have professors and doctors from university here? What is regulatory science? Nobody can answer that because it's not taught in any university, right? Is that true? You're so confused. But regulatory science is a very confusing science, right? Because people think regulatory environment is very complex. It's difficult. It is a hurdle. It's a pain in the neck. So what I'm going to do is to show you how you can use regulatory science in your business so that you're not caught on the wrong side of the law. Yeah. Thanks for the organizers for inviting me. I think it was very difficult for them to get me here. But they sent some serious negotiators who negotiated with me during the night because I was traveling most of the time. But the negotiators did a good job, Edric, so they got me here today. Which one? You know, technology. So yeah, I have to press it a bit harder. So what do I do today? So previously I used to work in government, in the private sector, but what do I do today? I work for myself. So I enjoy working for myself. So that's the name of my company. So I'm not going to talk much about it, but if you are interested in what I do, I'm sure you'll get to know what I do when I talk, right? So that's fine. That's a colorful slide. So just to sum up my life, forget about the logos and everything, I would sum it in two ways. Half of that, or half of my career life, was in the private sector. That's about 12 years. And the other half, I was a government bureaucrat. That's about 12 years. So it's equal, right? So half of my career life in government, half of my career life in the private sector. But now I've just started to find a new hobby, and that is called Retrose scientific, right? So what I do is all about regulatory. You can throw anything which is regulatory to me and see if I will be able to deal with it. So the topic of today is to say, how do we register Rhizobia in South Africa? As I was driving here, I was asking myself, do I really know Rhizobia? What does it look like? How does it look like? Have I ever touched it? So I was trying to think, over the number of years that I've worked, if I've seen it. And I had to think very hard to convince myself, do I know Rhizobia? As I was reaching the CSIR, then I got the answer that it looks like I do know it. It looks like I've touched it. But then I asked myself, where do I touch it? So working for government, you see a lot of things. You get invited in a lot of places. So yes, I've been fortunate to go into some factory to see Rhizobia in action. Now, I do not know, how do you view registration in South Africa? Because you cannot place anything in the market if it's not registered under Act 36 of 1947. It's quite an old act, yeah, but we'll talk about, the thinking behind the act and how maybe it was written. But when I was given the topic Rhizobia and how it's registered in South Africa, then I had to ask myself, how do we approach this? So we have to look at what is the definition of an ag remedy, and how do we define fertilizers in South Africa? And try to put that into a simple equation to say, is registration equal red tape or equal a hurdle? So it's for you to judge, right? So I do not manufacture Rhizobia. I do not know the pain that you go through to get it registered. But I know that when I was working there in my previous life, I was considered one of the difficult guys. But it came with a job, right? So it's okay. Right. Let's look at the scope of what is controlled under Act 36. It's quite a big act. It controls all the inputs that are sold in South Africa, from stock remedies or veterinary medicine. That is a sort of dual mandate between the Department of Health and DALRAD. You've got animal feeds component, and then you've got agricultural remedies and fertilizers. But where do we place Rhizobia in general? So you would see there are two blocks. It's either you can go the fertilizer route, or you can go the agricultural remedies route. And I will show you the differences as we proceed. Now, what is the purpose of the law? How do you view the law? My perception about the law is there to protect ourselves from ourselves. I don't know if you agree about that, or if you agree with me. Just to illustrate, imagine if the law allows us to brew our own alcohol. I'm sure half of us will be dead. That's why there's a law, right? But the law could be challenging, right? Because you can break the law without knowing that you are breaking the law. And ignorance is not an excuse if you are appearing in front of the judge. Let's zoom into the second definition. What is a fertilizer? If you look at a fertilizer in terms of the Act, it talks about a substance, right? And if you read that definition, then you realize that it's like biological side bit excluded, okay? But let's look at the definition of an ag remedy. So this one is a very interesting definition because it tells you it could either be a chemical substance or a biological remedy or a mixture of both. That's interesting. But for the context of today's meeting, that part B of that definition is what makes it very interesting. Because then you can define an ag remedy as a combination of a chemical and a biological to be used as what? It's either you're going to use it as a plant growth promoter or as a legume inoculant, or we can jump to the third definition, or you can use it as a biofertilizer or a group 3 fertilizer. Do you agree? But I think Adriano talked about soybeans. What are soybeans? Who can give me a crude definition in terms of grouping what are soybeans? They are legumes, right? So, if you use this law, if you come with an inoculant, which is going to put on a soybean seed, by default, it must be registered as an ag remedy, not as a biofertilizer. That's the law. But talking about tax compliance, I don't know if we've got tax experts. I think you're all agricultural experts here, but let's pretend to be tax experts. In tax, in South Africa, maybe in any other country, there are legal ways to avoid paying tax. But there are illegal ways to avoid paying tax. But then if you use the illegal ways, you will be in trouble. Why do I bring this reasoning into the discussion? But if you look at this definition, what about if I want to register my legume inoculant as a biofertilizer? How do I do that? How do I do that? Then you play into the realm of regulatory science. So you need the regulatory science experts to guide you. How do I do it? In terms of the law, it's all about labeling. So if you come with a biofertilizer and you want to place it as a soybean inoculant, please avoid the word legume inoculant. Then you have to go to the expert who should help you to craft your label. And such experts could be anybody. But those people should know what they're doing. Or you can come to me if you want. I'm not forcing you to come to me. But if you want, you can. Then I will be able to assist you. So this is the law, right? And this is where now there is a lot of confusion in the country to say, how do I register my things? I think when I was invited, I asked, but why am I being invited? And then they said, you wrote the rules. But I didn't write the law, but I wrote a lot of guidelines. The law was written in 1947, the year my father was born. So I helped to write some of the guidelines to sort of clarify how things could be registered in South Africa when I was in my previous job. So the point I'm making is you can register your product under the two streams, but you need to be very careful in terms of how you're going to market your product. Why do I put this? Going to what Adriano said, he talked about the fermentation process, right? When you talk about the fermentation process, you can also have the fermentation equipment, okay? So in South Africa, some of these laws, they work together. Let me tell you that in my previous life, I think we have denied the registration of one organism, one microorganism, using two pieces of legislation, if not three. The first one that we used was the National Health Act. And then the second one was Act 36 of 1947. So how did we do that? Remember, I'm diverting a bit, but it was all about regulating microorganisms in the country. So when you come to the regulator and say, look, I want to register this thing, the first thing, we're not interested in efficacy. I'm talking in my previous life, not in my current life. So we're not interested in efficacy or what it does to the crop in the field. The first thing is we are interested about safeguarding human beings. The second thing is to say, what will it do to the environment? Are we going to have problems in the environment? Then the third thing, it will be efficacy and how the crop will be protected. So in this example that I'm telling you, we looked at the effect of human health. And then it was found that this organism, it has got the potential to be used as a biological weapon. Right? So it was a big thing because the politicians were on our backs to say, please get this thing registered because we want to solve the problem of whatever in the townships. So being a regulator, it gives you the space to talk to experts in the country and outside of the country. So we looked at who are the experts in this instance to advise us on how to make the best regulatory decision. So we phoned the Department of Health that we are worried you've got a unit that deals with zoonotic diseases. Should we proceed to register this thing as an ag remedy? So they were a bit cagey, to advise us. So we decided, let's go to the National Institute of Occupational Health and throw this to them so that they can give us the best advice. So the advice came to say, please do not touch it because this could be a human pathogen and it has got the potential to be used as a biological weapon. So We denied the registration. So what I'm telling you is the regulatory work is a bit difficult because there's a lot of things to be considered. All these acts that I've listed there, I did list the Animal Disease Act. You would see that in the Republic, these are the acts that will be concerned with the security of the state, either from the chemical point of view or from the biological point of view. So, when you work with microorganisms, you need to ask yourself, what is the effect on a human being and what will be the effect in the environment? And it gets very complicated because when we look at the environment, we are looking at a lot of things, from bees to butterflies to fish to everything, right? But there are some sensitive species that we use to be guinea pigs in terms of tests, so that when it comes to the regulators, then the regulators would be able to make a decision to protect human beings and the environment. Just to test whether you were listening, when Adriano was about to finish, he talked about sustainability. Keep that word in mind. Right. Let's talk about data requirements, because this is a big thing when it comes to regulators in South Africa. In terms of the Act, right, you have to prove that your product is effective. It has to do what you're claiming on the label, right? And you see, this law was written in 1947 before the Constitution was adopted in 1996. But then it goes on to say, whatever you place in the market should be suitable and it should not be contrary to the so-called public interest. And you can define what is meant by public interest. Does this sort of meet the public scrutiny or the constitutional scrutiny of our Constitution and the Bill of Rights? You may find that this law, although it was written many, many years ago, it does to a certain extent sort of fulfill what is required by the current Constitution. Like I said, you can either consider the law to be a red tape, because there will be extensive requirements that you will have to prove to the regulator before a stamp is given for you to sell your product. The easy stuff for the researchers is to generate data. If you're talking about Rhizobia, does it fix nitrogen? How do we measure that? Which parameters are we going to use to prove that it is effective in terms of nitrogen fixation? And for that, if it's an ag remedy, it's prescribed. You need about maybe a minimum of 3 successful trials. If it's a biofertilizer, if you want to claim the whole group of legume or whatever, again, you will need at least 3 successful trials done over various bioclimatic zones in 1 season or 2 seasons, provided you can grow that crop in different zones in 1 season. The key thing is we need to identify the organism. It has to be identified, because the regulators should know what is the identity, what is the origin of this organism that we are dealing with. The other things that Adriano talked about is packaging. So the shelf life is very key, because the regulator would also want to protect the farmer. If you come with this living organism, how long will it stay in its packaging? Is it going to be 2 weeks? Is it going to be 6 months? Is it going to be a year? Right? So this has to be known, because then we need to write the label in a particular way. The big thing is the tox data. That's the most expensive part when it comes to product development. For new things, it's difficult. If you are an innovator, that's the burden that comes with regulatory. If you are an innovative company, there will be some significant investments that you will have to make, because the regulator will throw a book at you to say, tox-wise, please prove to me that this is safe to the environment, to human beings first, to the environment before we talk about efficacy. Okay? The sad thing, when we talk about the tox data, it has to be done in a GLP accredited lab. Unfortunately, in the country we do not have such establishments. So it's an added cost. So, but we tried, when I was working in the department, to sort of try and and lobby certain universities to try and develop this skill, but yeah, we sort of failed. But some universities tried, but universities are in the business of training students, and to put up these fancy labs to do this, it's not cost effective for them, right? But which is a huge gap for the country. Now, we talked about the tox data. So the tox data, it's used also to communicate risk to the end user. That's why you will see the label sometimes it's a yellow band, red band, blue band, or green band. All that information is derived from the tox package, okay? So that at least we can be able to come up with the so-called warning statements, precautionary statements, direction of use, based on the efficacy data and everything, and also to say if something happens, how do we advise the medical fraternity on how they should treat their patients, okay? So that's how the regulators would use that information to come up with the label. Now we are evolving. Like myself, I evolved from the private sector to the government sector to another sector, right? To think like a capitalist. So the system is evolving from the so-called WHO classification, the previous label that I showed you, where they use color codes based on the WHO six-pack or the acute studies classification in terms of the dermal, the oral, and the inhalation studies. But then we are transitioning to the so-called global harmonized system of labeling of chemicals. But today we're talking about Rhizobia. But Rhizobia is not a chemical. Why do I bring this topic, right? So I will give you a little bit of an exercise just to deduce, how does this thing work? So this system is designed so that when you handle anything which is a chemical, this is H2O. Is it a chemical? Maybe yes. So if you handle H2O, there must be common signs all over the world so that at least we can know the risk, so that it's not misinterpreted. That's the idea or the objective behind the GHS system. Think about the exclamation mark when I drew my simple equation when I started. Do you remember that? Registration equals to red tape equals to handle, exclamation mark, question mark. Keep that in mind. Okay? Right. Let the rubber hit the road. Remove the red tape. I'm just trying to get into the bandwagon. If you look at what is happening in the country, there is a drive to say, please, let's just remove the red tape. Because we want the economy to grow. Okay? I'm also jumping on the red bandwagon to say, let the rubber hit the road. And how do we do that? Why should we invent the wheel? If the risk is known, why should we have to reinvent to know the risk? To me, it's not the wise way of doing things. So, if I know that this water is already classified as non-hazardous, why should I go into a trouble of cracking my head to prove that it's non-hazardous? It's a waste of time. So that's what I'm saying. So, using the so-called the evolution process, when the regulator is moving from the WHO system of classifying chemicals to GHS, what are the so-called low-hanging fruit that I see from a regulatory science point of view that can move us from the, the red tape type of a situation to a green tape, if there's something like that, so that we can hit the road and move fast. Okay? It's a bit of an example. This is a hypothetical example. I didn't copy it from any secret formula. I just conjured that in my head. Just made it in my head. So let's talk about the formulation, because Adriano talked about the formulation. So I just want to give you that as an example, because I took that, the section 3 of the application form, particularly for ag remedies, just as an example for today's meeting. So let's say in that formulation I've got Rhizobia japonicum as the AI. That's the main biological active ingredient. And in that formulation I've got a clay mineral, bicarbonate, soda, and water, right? Like I told you, this water is already considered to be non-hazardous. I don't know if we have got young people who can go into their smartphones and quickly type bicarbonate soda space ECHA and see how it's classified, if you're fast. And also try and type in Google, using Google, type clay mineral space ECHA and tell me what you see. Okay? Just to make it quick, I've already told you this is non-hazardous. Bicarbonate soda is a food ingredient. Is it hazardous? Obviously not. What about clay mineral? What do you see? For those who are smart, did you get it to your smartphones or your computer? What is the classification of clay mineral? What do you see? Is it an eye irritant? Is it a serious eye irritant? Right? If we use GHS, how do I go back? If it's an eye irritant, so what symbol are we going to use? The exclamation mark. I'm just using logic, right? To quickly make a decision whether a substance is hazardous or not. So, that's why I'm saying let's go green. There's a drive in the world to reduce animal testing. That's still debated, whether we should use animals, rats, guinea pigs, birds, fish, to test the toxicity of veterinary drugs, human drugs, pesticides, and everything. There's a drive to say, let's reduce. We're not going to do away with animal experiments because we need to protect ourselves and also the environment. But what about if we use the so-called body of knowledge that is existing today to use a regulatory decision? Are we going to make a mistake? Obviously not, because if you've got good scientists who are very competent in what they do, the chances of making mistakes of using the so-called available knowledge is very slim. What about if we use the data that's already there based on other risk assessment done by other regulators? Can we move faster? Can we get the rubber hitting the road faster to get to paradise? Okay? But obviously, to protect the farmer, we cannot compromise on testing what Rhizobia should do. Right? It has to be done. That's a must. If we do this, what do? So you accelerate the system. So you put the system on steroids so that this green technology could be placed in the market as quickly as we can or as we want so that we can achieve the so-called the sustainability goals. That's the idea. That's the goal. I took a lot of time to think about this slide and how I was going to present this slide. I put the dollar signs and the rand signs. So in this industry, who makes the money? Do you make the money? Is there money in agriculture? You're so quiet. So all of you are loaded, right? You're loaded. So in our quest of making money, we have to be mindful of how do we make this money. Are we doing this in the expense of ourselves as human beings, poisoning ourselves every day? Are we doing this in the expense of the environment? You know, every day I took time to look at global news. And it said to look at what is happening in Pakistan. 1/3 of the country is underwater. And it said to look at what is happening in China in terms of the drought. You can see that China is slowing down. You know, if you send an email to China to get a response back, it's very difficult, compounded by COVID situation. If you look at Europe, the drought, it's also very scary. You look at the Americas, it's the same thing. As human beings, in our quest to make money or to make a living, let me not say make money, in our quest to make a living, let's be mindful of the so-called UN Sustainable Goals. I know that we are in the business of fighting hunger. We are producing food to fight hunger. But we know that some of this food that we produce is expensive. But we need good health, right? That's why now the regulators are there to make sure that whatever we spray on our crops should lead to good health, right? And we need to make sure that we protect our planet. With that, I thank you. I missed the one slide, but I tried to change this presentation a bit. But there's a line by Professor Einstein who said, let's try and make things as simple as possible, but not simpler. But I hope today I've tried to decode the so-called regulatory science into a simple science.